Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you had a lovely Shavuot holiday if you celebrated. This is Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations, and today we're looking at Psalm 16. And we're going to start the way we usually start with a reading of the Psalm in Hebrew and then some of our translations in English. And this Psalm, it has a bunch of liturgical connections, but it also has one of the most famous and important lines in all of Psalms, which is verse 8. Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid. I have placed Adonai before me always. And so we'll also spend some time thinking about that line, because separate from its liturgical use, that line has its own spiritual practice associated with it. All right, so we'll start with the reading of the psalm. Psalm 16. Michtam LaDavid, Shomreni El ki chasiti vach, Amart LaDonai, Adonai ata tovati bal alecha, Likdoshim asher ba'aretz hema va'adirei kol chefzevam, Yirbu atzevotam acher maharu bal asich, Niskehem midam uval esad shemotam al sfatai. Adonai menat chelki, v'chosi ata tomich gorali. Havalim naflu li bani imin, af nachalat shofra alai. Avarech et Adonai asher yatzani, af leilot yisruni chiliotai. Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid, ki mimini bal emot, lachen samach libi v'yagel kevodi, af besari yishkon lavetach. Ki lo ta'azov nafshi lish'ol, lo titein chasidcha lir'ot shachat, todi'eni orech chayim, sova smachot et panecha, neimot b'mincha netzach. So that is Psalm 16 in the original. And let's read a couple of the translations.
Can't read it.
Here's a translation from the Jewish Publication Society. That's on the left-hand side of page 2. A michtam of David. Protect me, O God, for I seek refuge in you. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord, my benefactor. There is none above you. As to the holy and mighty ones that are in the land, my whole desire concerning them is that those who espouse another God may have many sorrows. I will have no part of their bloody libations. Their names will not pass my lips. The Lord is my allotted share and portion. You control my fate. Delightful country has fallen to my lot. Lovely indeed is my estate. I bless the Lord who has guided me. My conscience admonishes me at night. I am ever mindful of the Lord's presence. He is my right hand, I shall never be shaken. So my heart rejoices, my whole body rests secure. For you will not abandon me to Sheol, or let your faithful ones see the pit. You will teach me the path of life. In your presence is perfect joy. Delights are ever in your right hand. Let's also look here at Rabbi Richard Levy. A michtam of David. Protect me, God, I have taken refuge in you. I thought to myself, I said to Adonai, you are my superior. There is no good for me but in you. Here's to the holy beings who are on the earth and the noble souls in whom all my delight. Let the sorrows from others' idols multiply. They have betrothed themselves to the alien. I shall not offer their libations. They are poured from blood, nor will I take up their names on my lips. Adonai is my portion, my libation. You uphold my destiny. The boundaries of my life have been marked in pleasant ways. Indeed, this heritage has become more and more beautiful for me. I will bless Adonai who has advised me. Indeed, come night and my innards instruct me. I have set Adonai before me always, at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore, my heart rejoices, my self-respect exults, my body dwells secure. For you will not abandon my being to Sheol. You will not let members of your covenant behold the pit. You let me know the path of life. Wholesome joys are with your presence. In your right hand are pleasant things forever. And I'll just do one more. This is the King James Version. Michtam of David. Preserve me, O God, for in thee do I put my trust. O my soul, thou hast said unto the Lord, thou art my Lord, my goodness extendeth not to thee, but to the saints that are in the earth, and to the excellent, in whom is all my delight. Their sorrows shall be multiplied that hasten after another God. Their drink offerings of blood will I not offer, nor take up their names into my lips. The Lord is the portion of mine inheritance, and of my cup thou maintainest my lot. The lines are fallen unto me in pleasant places. Yea, I have a goodly heritage. I will bless the Lord who hath given me counsel. My reins also instruct me in the night seasons. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my glory rejoiceth. My flesh also shall rest in hope. For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. So first, does anybody have any immediate reactions or thoughts? What is the feeling, the emotion contained in this psalm?
Imminence and presence.
Okay, Larry says the overwhelming theme of this psalm is God's presence, God's imminence, which is a fancy word for meaning that God is not far away, but God is right here, right with us, in the room, in our hearts, in our daily experience. God is not transcendent. God is not in some lofty heights that are impossible to access. God is right here. All right, so the overwhelming theme is that of imminence. What's the emotion? What do you feel when you read this psalm?
Very positive.
Mishka says it's a positive psalm. I feel good.
It's so different from some of the others, which bring in all kinds of negatives. This one does not.
Right. Psalm 16 does not have at its core struggle or conflict, which many of our previous psalms that we've looked at so far in the book of Psalms have. At the heart of those psalms is a struggle with faith, a struggle with enemies. Right at the heart is some conflict in life. Psalm 16 doesn't have that. That is absent from this psalm. Instead, we get a sense of God's presence, gratitude, confidence, hope. The experience of this psalm is much more positive.
Self-comforting. It's very self-comforting to know that one is enveloped in the presence and the spirit of God.
Nice. So Murray says the psalmist, in describing this experience of lived life in God's presence, is creating a comforting feeling, a self-comforting feeling that there is a right path, and that right path can be walked. Last week when we looked at Psalm 15 and it described what is a righteous person, and we looked at all the different ways to think about that righteousness, one of the things that we talked about was how much of a high standard that was, right? But this psalm, which follows right up on that psalm, right? The righteous person lives a life in the presence of God, but here this psalm doesn't go through describing the deeds of a person of righteousness. Instead, it says, right, I have placed God in front of me always. And that's the secret. That's the whole thing.
There's a sense that you've moved beyond actions and deeds, and you're allowing God's presence and almost communication to reveal the path for you, and that the path doesn't lead to an eternal life necessarily. It leads to abundant joy right now.
Nice. Although there is a lot of hope that death is not the end. That death is not the end.
Yes.
That's also there.
But it begins now. It begins now. It's
Yeah.
not sorrow and then later you'll get joy. It's if you listen to God, follow him now, let him guide you, help you make your decisions. Ask God before you decide. You will have abundant joy now. And at your right hand are also eternal pleasures. So
Right.
it's an experiencing of the kingdom now.
Yeah. So let's look at some of the commentaries that I brought. So I've shared that verses 8 and 9, right, are used in our Yizkor service. So this past Saturday we had an opportunity to do memorial prayers in honor of those who have gone to their eternal rest. And as we do on the second day of every or the final day of every holiday. And in the conservative movement Yizkor, verses 8 and 9 of this psalm are used. And so here's the Lev Shalem's, that's our Siddur, our prayer book. Here's the translation that we use for that. Adonai is always before me at my right hand, lest I fall. Therefore I am glad, made happy, though I know that my flesh will lie in the ground forever. So there's right. So here, right, the in the context of our memorial prayers, these verses are translated in such a way where, yeah, death is a part of it. Death is a part of it, but death, even though we know that we're going to die, death does not take away the joy of our living. And I think that that's very powerful, and it's especially powerful in the context of our memorial service. So does anyone have any thoughts or reflections about that? I couldn't help but be thinking about the whole context of Psalm 16 when I was reading those verses on our holiday this past Saturday, since I knew we were going to be studying it in just a couple days. Henry.
Yes.
Yeah,
I mentioned it to you.
You were there, and you're remembering specifically your father who died on the second day of Shavuot.
Right. And it's funny, I mentioned it to you after the service. I said, oh my God, there's the psalm.
Yeah.
I have a question. Why is it always the right hand? I know sincere and all of that, but why always the right hand? As a lefty, I'm always offended.
Yeah, I hear that. I think I'm gonna have to do a little bit more research. I don't want to respond right off the top, but I think, like, it probably is a little biased toward
Yeah.
toward the 90% or whatever of individuals whose preference is toward their right side. Let me do a little research on, like, I know that in the Kabbalistic world, the right side has specific significance, but it would be anachronistic to ascribe to the psalm a particular sense of, like, or the Kabbalistic understanding of God's right side. And so what I have to do is sort of find out what exactly it is that um that the biblical authors meant by the right
Yeah.
side. So
And
I'll look into that.
I think even in Greco-Roman times, punishment was cut off the right hand, and all of that. So I'm sure it goes back quite a few thousand years.
Yeah.
Have people accused you of being in a left field?
Yeah, there you go.
Right. So this verse, Shiviti Adonai Lenegdi Tamid, also has an artistic an artistic tradition, which, and I've given sort of an explanation of that artistic tradition here. A Shiviti, right, where it refers to a specific artistic mode, is a meditative representation of a verse from Psalms, usually Psalm 16, verse 8, which is why it's called Shiviti, why it's called a Shiviti. After that, the first word of that psalm, I have placed God before me always. But a Shiviti can also just be a meditative representation of the name of God. So one type of Shiviti is placed at the front of a synagogue, where it also represents, look this way when you pray, because that's the direction toward Jerusalem. And another popular format of Shivitis can be found in prayer books. They originate actually in the Sabbatean heresy, the movement of folks who followed Shabtai Tzvi in the 17th century. It was a huge movement of Jews who, having lived in rough conditions, like sort of felt that, oh, the Messiah must be coming soon, and Shabtai Tzvi claimed to be the Messiah, and then in the end he converted to Islam with many of his followers, and he was declared persona non grata. And anyway, we don't really talk about Sabbatianism much nowadays, but it was very, very important and influential for many decades in the 17th century. And apparently these Shivitis, these spiritual representations of this verse and of the name from God, have its origins in the Sabbatean movement, and they were banned and understood as being very disrespectful by the prominent rabbinic authorities of the time period. And now, of course, they, I think in part because of that, they have proliferated. If the rabbinic establishment had just ignored it, it probably would have just gone away. But anyway, so today you mostly find them not in conservative synagogues, but in Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox synagogues. Though we have a beautiful Shiviti in our biblical garden, which was designed and created and donated by our own Mishka Luft, who's here. Anyway, so I've given some examples of Shivitis, and we can look at them here. So this one here on the left is an example of a common prayer book version of a Shiviti. And you can see that it says here at the top, Da lifnei mi ata umein, know before whom you're standing. Lifnei melech malchei amlachim hakadosh baruch hu, you're standing before the sovereign of above all sovereigns, the holy blessed one. And then it says here Shiviti with a very long taf, Shiviti, and then God's name, Adonai, Lenegdi with a very long dalid, and then here Tamid. And then a lot of this is a Kabbalistic material that I'm not an expert in, so I can't explain all of it. And I'm not sure what Kaf Mem Bet Aleph stands for, but I'm just not sure. But here it says Yud Aleph Hey Dalid Vav Nun Hey Yud, and what that is it's God's name interspersed with the Hebrew letters that spell out Adonai. So like God's holy name, the Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, is interspersed here with the letters that spell out how we pronounce that word. We don't try to pronounce God's holy name. We consider that Tetragrammaton to be so holy and the correct pronunciation of it lost. And even if we had the correct pronunciation of it, really the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, only said that name one time a year, and that was on Yom Kippur. And we wouldn't casually pronounce God's name. It's interesting, right? Christians often spell that name out and pronounce it as Jehovah, and the Jewish tradition doesn't do that. So instead, we replace that whenever we get to that name in our prayers, we replace it with the word Adonai, which means the Lord, my Lord, or we say Hashem, which literally means the name, and it refers to that name. So, and it depends on the context. If you're doing it in prayer, you might say Adonai, and if you're doing it not in prayer, you might say Hashem. And anyway, but the word Adonai can also be written out in regular letters. You don't have to write Yud He Vav He to mean the word my Lord. And so there's a tradition in this kind of artistic representation to intersperse God's name with so where it's every other letter, the letters that spell out Adonai and God's Tetragrammaton. And over here, it's the same thing, where you have Adonai and the Yud He Vav He interspersed, except instead of starting with Yud, you start with Aleph. So it's like there are two ways to do it. One is 5 letters and one is 4 letters. But you can intersperse starting with either word. And so both of them are here on either side. And in the middle, it's Agale, which means I will reveal myself. So it's like God will reveal God's self. And then, like I said, I don't know enough to be able to truly parse out what is going on here with this menorah, but I can say that the words are fashioned into this representation of the 7-branched candelabrum from the temple, and that is very, very common in these kinds of shivitis. Mishka.
I've often had trouble in doing something like this with putting the Hebrew so it's all in one direction. I can do it in many directions, but I'm kind of learning from this how to a trick for how to do that, coming from the center of the candelabrum.
Yeah, I mean the words are all different in all different directions here.
Right, and
they're not.
It's confusing, and yet there is, for me, some real conscious construction.
Yeah, there's definitely some construction. Here, the letters that are sort of like being like the candle flames on top of the menorah says Lamanatzeach bin Ginot Mizmor Shir. So that leads me to believe that what follows here is the psalm that starts with that. With that. With that superscription. So, but I can't really read it. So then I've given us also to look at a couple of other examples. So these are both examples that would go on the front of at the front wall of a synagogue. This one here on the left, that just says Shiviti Adonai Le'negdi in beautiful script, in beautiful font on a yellow background. Like this, you could also find in a person's private house. Like it's just pretty. You wouldn't find this, the one on the right, in a private house. That's clearly it was designed for the front of a synagogue, and you can see the sort of representation here of the eternal light, which I think is very similar in some ways to the menorah. That Shiviti presence, the idea of God's presence is connected very deeply to light. And it says here on the top, know before whom you stand. I have placed God before me always. And then here is the person who for whom this plaque was dedicated in honor. All right, so somebody gave money so that this person's name would be on this plaque forever. And all right, so then here we have a more modern version of a Shiviti. But you can see also in the here's also here you see that Adonai is written out in white, interspersed with the dark Yud Hey Vav Hey. So that's interesting. That's an interesting choice. And it also has the verse, know before whom you stand, before Melech Malchei Melchim, the sovereign of sovereigns, the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And this one here on the far right, this is the Shiviti that is in our biblical garden that Mishka did. And this Shiviti, it's not the representation of the whole psalm, or even the whole verse from Psalms. It's just God's name. And I think it feels weird for me to be explicating this in front of the artist herself, but it feels to me like this particular version of a Shiviti is following the tradition of understanding God's holy name as being able to be written as the human body itself, with the Yud as the head, and the first Hey as the torso and arms, the Vav representing the backbone and the core, and then the second Hey representing the legs. And so there's a way in which God's holy name is itself symbolic of God's image. And this is another reason why many mainstream rabbis were sort of against Shivitis, because there's the potential to be sort of overly connected to a physical representation of God, right? This is like, it's a very edgy, it's an edge case, right? There's no representation of God as having physical form, and yet you can clearly see in this work the offering that God's name is reflected in a human being. And since we are made in the image of God, and God's breath, God's holy name is like a breath, and God's breath is breathed in to the human being and animates us. And I think that this particular, at least for me, that's part of what this artistic representation is doing. Yeah, Larry.
In addition, I think there's something, at least for me, there's an interpenetration of dimensions. That is, there's a presence and the positive and the negative of God.
Yeah,
That-
I was gonna mention that too, right? Like
Which
many
also-
of Mishka's works.
Which ties to the Psalm, back to the Psalm after verse 8, verses 9, 10, and 11. It's not clear whether we're talking about eternal life of the soul, or whether there's joy here. And some of the translations, my flesh goes down; others, I live forever. It's a dimensional, not challenge, but metaphor, I think, somehow, that is this life a life that continues? Is the joy that we experience in the presence of God something that continues after our flesh goes to the ground? What is the nature of now and eternity? It's almost evoked by that wonderful piece of art.
Yeah, right. And I love that in this piece of art, God's name is the negative space, and not right. That is, and that's also sort of the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name for God, is a non-existent form of the verb to be, right? So the verb to be in the past tense is hey yud hey haya, and in the present tense it's hey vav vav hey hoveh, and in the future tense it's yud hey yihyeh. And you can tell that all those letters are the letters that form God's name, but the particular set of 4 letters, that is a non-existent form of that verb. So it's almost like that verb means God is, was, will be, or right, eternity, but non-existent eternity, like God isn't and God is, and so there's something very powerful about that. This representation that Mishka did with the negative space, I think, very nicely represents the non-speaking. We do not say that name. And so, and we also then, in some sense, Mishka is sort of saying, we do not write the name. We do not see God, except in the way that, like, you don't see the wind, but you see the effects of the wind. So here in this image, like, God, you don't see the letters of God's name. You only see them in their absence, in their negative space, with respect to the background, to the field. And
if you picked any one of them, that would be to limit God.
Yeah,
This
right.
this gives you the sense of the unlimitedness of God.
Nice.
Mishka, have we done your work justice?
You have done my work justice, and I thank you for it. I wanted to make a comment, well, 2 comments. One is the decision to make it, period. And we have one in our garden, which is very much helping, if that's the right word, to keep the word of God and to keep God in our minds. We look out the window, or in the summer right now, you can see in this one of the creations of God, and then it goes beyond humans. It goes into other kinds of life. It's here, it's seasonal, but it's something that came up when we placed it in the biblical garden, and it's something that has come up in our personal shviti. Doing it in the negative came out because I had done some in the positive, not in metal, but they just didn't work. They just did not work. Part of the problem is when you do something in the positive, everything has to connect or they fall off the paper. This didn't require that kind of connections, except you can see little bits to the frame. But it just didn't work in the positive. It just did not do anything emotional. So for a number of reasons, I switched to doing it in the negative.
Good choice.
Thank you.
All right, so I did bring some more interpretations of this verse. So Rashi says, what does it mean? It means, in all my deeds, I have placed fear of God before me. Why? Because God is always at my right hand to help me so that I should not falter. So for Rashi, Shiviti Adonai Lenegdi Tamid, I have placed God before me, means I have placed the fear of God before me. And it means that with respect to any action that I take, I'm asking myself, is this a godly action? What would God think of this action? The Radak says, as something which is before a man always, so that it departs not from his eyes and mind, so I have placed the glory of God always before me, for I know that God is in my right hand. So I think Radak is focusing less on the actions and more on the memory, on the act of remembering. What does it mean to place God before you always? Is so that God will never depart from your mind. The Rambam also quotes this verse in the Guide to the Perplexed. And he says, I have shown you that the intellect, which emanates from God unto us, is the link that joins us to God. Well, remember that the Guide to the Perplexed is Maimonides' attempt to sync up Jewish teachings with Neo-Aristotelian philosophy. Maimonides believed that Aristotle's philosophical teachings were universal truths, and he wanted to show that that the Jewish people's Torah could also be derived in that same kind of philosophical way. It was also reflective of universal truth. So that's the project of the Guide to the Perplexed. Maimonides is a Neo-Aristotelian philosopher who really wants to push the round peg of Jewish thinking into the square box of Aristotelian philosophy. And if there's anybody in history who could have done it, and in some ways shown that it's not a round peg at all, it was Maimonides. He was a genius. So he's talking, when he talks about the intellect which emanates from God. This is an Aristotelian sort of thought that pure intellect, pure reason, is the purest form of divine connection. You have in your power to strengthen that bond if you choose to do so, or to weaken it gradually till it breaks. It will only become strong when you employ it in the love of God and seek that love. It will be weakened when you direct your thoughts to other things. You must know that even if you were the wisest man in respect to the true knowledge of God, you break the bond between you and God whenever you turn entirely your thoughts to the necessary food or necessary business. You are then not with God, and God is not with you. For that relation between you and God is interrupted in those moments. The pious were therefore particular to restrict the time in which they could not meditate upon the name of God, and cautioned others about it, saying, let not your minds be vacant from reflections upon God. In the same sense, David said, did David say, I have set the Lord before me always, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. That is, I do not turn my thoughts away from God. God is like my right hand, which I do not forget even for a moment on account of the ease of its motions. And therefore I shall not be moved, I shall not fail. And so Maimonides is saying, when you distract yourself in your day-to-day routine from pure contemplation of God, those are moments where God is not with you. I just want to say, right, this is consistent, not just with Maimonides' way of thinking, but with a lot of the thinking of pre-modern philosophy. in my experience, both of studying philosophy in college and also my own like personal lived experience, nowadays, and I'm saying nowadays, like in the last few decades, the nowadays philosophical teachings have changed our understanding, right? I do not believe that there is I look, I'm not a fluent philosopher, but I believe that there are like postmodern and contemporary philosophical teachings that preference experiential understandings of the world and that do not ascribe to Aristotle's intellect and pure reason as being the only way forward. And when you study a history of ideas, you find that there's always been some kind of a tension between sort of pure reason and romanticism, that is to say, between the like a preference more on experience. I guess for me, I do not experience God as being absent when I have food, when I eat food or go to the bathroom or have sex, or right, like I do not find those activities to separate my consciousness from God in the way that Maimonides seems to have felt that, like, if you get distracted even for a moment, you're completely cut off. It seems very extreme to me. My experience is less extreme than that.
God seems to be showing that there is an interpenetration of the intellect and the experience and the present and the future and the past. That eternity doesn't start tomorrow. It's been running on for some time.
I agree with that. Yeah. So the Ramah, the Ramah is the Ashkenazi gloss to the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah also quotes this verse in his introduction to the Shulchan Aruch, in his introduction to the most important code of Jewish law. And he writes, the person who contemplates well that the Holy Blessed One is always present, standing above us and observing our every deed, cannot help but be overwhelmed by awe, humility, dread, and shame. For God is always present. God is always present. And so for Moshe Isserlis, the key word in that psalm is tamid, always. God is always present, which is, by the way, also why the eternal flame, the menorah, why that's connected to this is because we also call that the ner tamid, the eternal flame, the constant flame. And so I've set God before me always, always. That word is very important in the sort of spiritual reflection of this psalm. Yeah, Rav Hirsch says the Hebrew root for shiviti is shin vav hey, which means equal, shaveh, equal. We must imagine God to be our equal. The presence of God can be found in the midst of earthly life, with all its triviality and all its ugliness. Let me read you more of this teaching from Rav Hirsch. I only gave a little bit here. We must not seek God in some lofty and sublime place, aloof and unconcerned with all that is mundane. Quite the contrary, we must imagine God to be our equal. That is, the presence of God is to be found in the midst of earthly life, with all its triviality and even with its ugliness. Nothing is too small or too base to escape God's gaze and God's care. The close affinity to God, which is the theme of our psalm, requires awareness, which many will find heretical, that God is not high above us in some far-removed celestial abode. God is not in God's sacred heaven. God is down here with us on the same playing field. As strange as it sounds to pious ears, shiviti, I must conceive of God as somehow equal to me, close enough so that God can empathize with me, so that I can exclaim, "Guard me, God, for I seek refuge in you." Refuge can only be found with someone who is nearby, with someone whose circumstances are equal to mine. To use philosophical terminology, the God of our psalm is an immanent God, not a transcendent God. God is with us on earth and not aloft in the heavens. The realization that God is equal, that God is always nearby, inspires the expressions of utter confidence which permeate our psalm. With God at my right hand, I shall not falter. For you will not abandon my soul to the grave. You will make known to me the path of life. Murray.
I would say that as an overall theme, what it tells us is that we do not take God for granted, that God will be present there, but we must actively, consciously feel the presence of God. It isn't that you come to in many synagogues by the Yom you see Shriti and so on, but it is an act of consciousness that one places God in the presence in all the aspects of one's life. I mean, any other way would saying that God is there. I'm just come here, God is there.
At hand.
Yeah.
At hand.
So I got so overwhelmed by my excitement about this verse that and this verse in the context of the psalm that I forgot to share with you some of the other ways in which we've used this psalm in our liturgy. So we can go back and look at some of those. So there's a tradition that the priests reenact the giving of the priestly blessing on holidays. It is not the tradition of our synagogue, much to my sadness, because I really love this experience, which we call duchening, right? When the priests go up to the elevated duchan and offer the blessing to the kahal, to the congregation, and everybody doesn't look at them because lest you be blinded by God's physical presence being, coming off of the priests like light, and the priests also cover their hands with the talit so that you can't see even if you accidentally look over. But what they're doing is they're holding their hands out like this, which is why this is the symbol of the Kohanim. For any Star Trek fans out there, the reason why the Vulcans do this for live long and prosper is because Spock, Leonard Nimoy, was Jewish. He was a Kohen, and he was just like, they needed something to be what he would do, live long and prosper, and he just put up his hand like this, because the live long and prosper is very similar in content to the priestly blessing. Anyway, so and Leonard Nimoy, by the way, wrote about it. Wrote about that particular thing. Shatner, by the way, also a member of the tribe. Anyway, all of this to say, when the priests would get up to bless the people, the shaliach tzibor, the chazan, person who's leading the service, quietly says each word by word, and then the priests repeat it really loudly for the kahal. And I think that's just because we don't want the priests to make a mistake. And they're not looking at the book. So we have the person who's looking at the book feeds them the words. It also is a great elevator. Any Kohen can do it, not just a literate Kohen. And then the kahal is just supposed to listen to these words of blessing pouring over you, but there are some traditions that ask the kahal, as you get the blessings, to say verses from Psalms that are connected. So to the theme of that word. So for example, if the Kohanim are saying Yivarechecha, may God bless you, so then you would say verses from Psalms that's connected to that idea of blessing. And so there are two traditional ones, Psalm 134:3 and Psalm 103:1. Right? May God bless you from Zion. God is the creator of heaven and earth. And Barchi nafshi et Adonai. Bless my soul, God, and all of all of the parts of my being will praise your holy name. And then I've given you also for Adonai, but we're going to skip that. And then V'yishmerecha in one of the lines for that verse, for the last word V'yishmerecha and protect you, is Psalm 16:1, Shomreni el ki chasiti vach, which is from our psalm. Preserve me, God, for in thee I do put my trust. And so while the priests are saying V'yishmerecha, right, you are quietly saying Shomreni el ki chasiti vach, which is, it's kind of a nice thing there where like, what does it mean that God should guard you? Well, here are two other verses from Psalms that have that same word in it that might expand for you what it is that God is doing when God guards you. And then there's a tradition of learning Pirkei Avot, which is a section from the Mishnah, as part of the Shabbat afternoon service in the summer, from Shavuot through Rosh Hashanah. And that so the reason why this showed up when I searched, are there liturgical connections to this psalm? The reason why it showed up is because a lot of Sidurim contain this passage from Mishnah in the Shabbat afternoon prayer service. So it's in the text of the Sidur, but what it really is a quote from the Mishnah. So the Mishnah quotes this psalm in Mishnah Avot 6:10, and it says, God has 5 special possessions that are set aside for God in this world. 5 special God possessions, and they are the Torah, heaven and earth, Abraham, Israel, meaning the people of Israel, and the temple. So these are like God's special holy possessions. And then the Mishnah goes through and says, how do we know that God possesses each of these things? And it gives verses. And for Israel, for the people of Israel, one of the verses that's quoted is as a proof text for this is verse 3. Verse 3 of our psalm, that that the righteous are God's delight. And so that's one of the verses that, right, as it says, as to the holy and mighty ones that are in the land, my whole desire, my whole possession is in them. So God loves the Jewish people, and that's one of the connections. So on Hoshana Rabbah, which is the last day of Sukkot, we take the lulav and the etrog and we march around the synagogue 7 times, and each time we recite a prayer, the hosannas, the hoshanot, and we in between each of those prayers we recite verses from Psalms. And so between one of the verses that we recite as we go through is the end of this psalm, Ne'imot b'mincha netzach. Ne'imot b'mincha netzach. That eternity, the eternity of delight can be forever. And so, right, in that context, right, that is part of our sort of 7-day long rain dance where we're asking God for prosperity in this world, without the rain, without forgiveness, the rain doesn't come according to Jewish theology, and without the rain, there's no harvest. And so on Sukkot, we're praying for rain, but it's really a broader prayer for forgiveness and for righteous community and for living a life that is deserving of rain. And in those prayers, we acknowledge the joy and the imminence and the presence of God in this psalm. And then finally, and I think this is important because I'm going to bring it up every time we get to one of these psalms. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, he picked 10 psalms that he said were the general remedy. Okay, he believed that if you read these 10 psalms, they were the ones that they were in a very important spiritual practice, especially after committing minor sins, right? Like, how do you recommit to relationship with God after the rupture of a sin? And Psalm 16 is the first of those 10 psalms that he considered were the most important, the general remedy. And he also believed that these psalms were very representative of the entire book of Psalms, and also of all the different types of song that could be contained in the book of Psalms. So
Do you have those at hand? Can you?
All 10 of them? No,
Yes.
I don't. But I know that the first one is Psalm 16.
I need them.
I think the next one is 37 or 36. Let me I
Please
had
send them out.
Yeah, I'll send them out in my email.
Great.
So the last one, by the way, of his 10 is Psalm 150, the final psalm of the book of Psalms, which is not surprising. That psalm is like particularly beautiful. And anyway, so he believed, we sometimes divide up psalms by here. These psalms are psalms of thanksgiving, and these psalms are psalms of supplication, and these psalms are psalms of lament. And he believed that these 10 that he picked were very representative of all the different types of psalms and songs, right? If you just did these 10, he said, this will help in a spiritual connection. And there might be other psalms that you might want to say for specific reasons or that are contained in the liturgy, but if you're just looking for 10, these are the 10. And the first one is Psalm 16. And I think, right, it's interesting to me that he didn't pick Psalm 1, right? I mean, it's not that surprising, but that is to say, Psalm 1 was written in some sense to begin to be an introduction to the book of Psalms, but it wasn't necessarily written with the idea that it was the most spiritually significant psalm. Whereas Psalm 16 is a very spiritually significant psalm, right? If you, in your spiritual practice, right? And we've talked about how you might use some of these other psalms in spiritual practice, especially as you're dealing with trials and tribulations and enemies that come up, either internal or external enemies. But if you're looking for a psalm that's just about spiritual connection to God, this is the first one that has that as its primary theme. And I think, so to me, that's like Rebbe Nachman's 10 psalms is a good clue to the spiritual import of these psalms. And so with that, we'll close, because I think, right, this psalm really speaks to that theme of relationship with and connection to God.
Sure.
All right, thank you. So next week we will meet, which is June 8th, maybe, or 7th or 6th, whatever, the Tuesday at the beginning of June. That will be our final class before the summer. 2 weeks from now, I'm going to be out on a 5-day seminar to learn about kashrut and to brush up my skills as a kosher supervisor for our synagogue kitchen. And the following week, I'm going on personal family vacation to visit my grandmother in St. Louis. It'll be my first time visiting since my grandfather died in January. And then after that, we're like in the middle of the summer. And so we will meet next week, and then we'll come back at the end of August. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for
Thank you,
bringing
Rabbi.
my work in. I was blushing. Thank you.
Wonderful work. Wonderful thing.